So Lori Sampson, City Administrator, and I am here to find out how we set up a regional housing authority and what we can or cannot do with the existing City of Leadville Housing Authority, what becomes of that, and sort of what it does and how those things we figure out how it either absorbs into or is faster taken over. And then just the makeup of what the Regional Housing Authority Board would look like.
Sarah Mudge, County Commissioner. I hope to get out of this meeting what we want the role of a housing authority to be, who does what, where the strengths are, and then what the benefit of that of a housing authority would be, because I think that helps frame the question of then the makeup and then us discussing with City Council those authorities, delegating. I think the other thing that I would love to, like, I realize that there's kind of a different cadence that maybe city and county work on, and so maybe incorporating that conversation, like the reality of like where everybody's starting from, kind of with their understanding of this specific topic, I suppose, and not to derail an agenda, but it might be great to like keep the conversations going, city and county, like internally, of trying to make sure that we're moving at the same pace. I know it's not necessarily fair that we have different basically volunteering or a full-time job. So I think it's worth recognizing the speed at which we're moving.
Thanks, Tracy. Tracy Lawrenson, City Council, what she said, what he said, what he said. I got nothing new to add.
Okay, well, thanks, Tracy. Rod?
Rod Weston, member of the school board. I'm just here to listen and try to keep up to date on things.
Chris Floyd, County Attorney, and I'm just here on behalf, kind of, I guess, of both me and Christiana McCormick, the City Attorney, have been looking into some of the legal questions that y'all have.
Jackie, do you have anything as staff?
No, I do want to say something though. Christy had brought up some concern about the Tabor Brand being under new management. I just wanted to put that out there that we did reach out to the ownership of the Tabor Brand, and that is not changing. It will continue even though the credit will be expiring. It's a long email. I sent it to a bunch of you, so I didn't want to speak out of turn, but we had a lot of good information, so I just forwarded his email. But that's exciting.
Hey, Jack, who operates it?
So it's Wheelhouse, and Christy was rightfully concerned because they had started to manage Eagle's Nest when Eagle's Nest was sold, and of course the rents weren't way up. But that's not the concern. We just need management, and we're not happy with their existing management company. They didn't feel like the property was being taken care of, and they didn't feel like the residents were being taken care of. And so they wanted to go with somebody that was comfortable and familiar with ITAC, so they didn't have any compliance issues. So.
Kayla Marcella, Lake County Commissioner. I don't have anything new to add. I think I have between Sarah and Lori's comments of making sure that we understand what housing authority does, what authority we're delegating, and what the mission of the housing authority would be, what happens to the existing housing authority. So yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff Fiedler, County Commissioner. I mean, yeah, really the same questions. And I think the memo is great. Yeah, like what we needed to do, what authority we have, and how do we get from where we are today, the City Housing Authority, to there most quickly and efficiently. I guess I decided at some point interested in like what, with the authority we give it, what's the sort of budget needs, staffing needs. Yeah, but I think that's sort of then secondary to the first one. So yeah.
Okay, so with that, I'm just gonna turn it over to Michael and Jackie to run the meeting. What's that?
Run going.
Oh, yeah, it's online.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Show participants.
Can we? Christian from City Council is also online. Christian, do you want to introduce yourself and just give us a quick outline of the objectives you hope to get from the meeting tonight?
Hey, I'm Christian. I hope to get what everyone else has really been saying. Sorry, I'm not there in person. I'm out of town for the weekend.
Thanks for joining us, Christian. Hey, I think that's it for City Council on participants online. I think that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to start with the first question that came up. When we started down, this meeting was really originally on the schedule to intend to talk through different ways we could structure potentially a housing authority, regional housing authority, whether we're gonna keep it under the county auspices, working collaboratively. There was a conversation that was initiated about the existing Leadville Housing Authority potentially becoming a regional housing authority. And when I initially read the bylaws of that, there was a little bit of a red flag that came up. And I questioned whether or not we could legally actually do that. And so we spun that question to the legal counsel of the city and the county before we spent a lot of time trying to go down a path that wasn't possible. So Chris, maybe you can shed a little bit of light on that.
Sure. So there are three different statutes that come into play. The one that the existing cities housing authority was created under is specific to a city housing authority. There's another statute that applies to specific county housing authority, but there's a third one that pertains to multi-jurisdictional housing authorities, and that allows for the city and the county to essentially collaborate to create an entity. And essentially under the code, what happens when that is created is that it becomes the successor. In fact, any existing housing authorities operated by the parties to that. So the city's housing authority, the county doesn't have one right now. So essentially the multi-jurisdictional housing authority will become the successor to the city one. Then the question becomes, okay, then what happens to the city's, housing authority? And there are a number of options that are possible with that. Number one, it's a creature, it was created by the city, so it could be dissolved by the city if that was the choice. It could also be retained in terms of continuing to operate. I understand that it currently manages a piece of property and some of the senior housing. And so it could continue on if that's what the city decides to do with it, and perhaps partner. The multi-jurisdictional housing authority will also have the ability to contract with different entities, including the existing city housing authority, to perhaps manage certain projects or whatever the multi-jurisdictional housing authority decides that it needs those type of support services. So that's kind of where we are now. I will try to answer any questions, and I apologize, Christiana and I literally were working almost to the last minute before she went out of town on this. So we don't have all the nuts and bolts, but this is we've confirmed between the two of us that statutorily that is the structure. So, but I'm happy to try and answer. Jeff?
Yeah, so I thought I had heard at some point in the housing journey that you can't have two at the same time in a jurisdiction, but I guess I'm hearing that.
It essentially, and as I said, it essentially, the multi-jurisdictional housing authority becomes the umbrella, if you will.
Mhm.
But there is nothing, the statute says there's nothing that requires, if there is an existing housing authority, for it to essentially go away. But what you have to do is you essentially have to contract to clearly define what their roles and responsibilities are going to be. So it's not like the city's housing authority could continue to do the same stuff that the multi-jurisdictional one would do.
And I think just from where I sit, I want to, with the existing housing authority, we're not, this process is going to take time. And so I want to ensure that we don't lose track that the existing housing authority serves a very specific function right now and should continue that, because the Jackie's already got a good plate. The idea of trying to add property management, taking on employees and all of that, while trying just to get all of the stuff that we're gonna talk about tonight. I think I'm just from an outsider as a consultant in the room, would be not something I would put on, a newly formed regional jurisdictional housing authority. So I would encourage that discussion and that board continues to operate and function, because you are servicing a very important need in the community by operating. And then as we go through this, if that comes a priority property management, something that's actually on the list tonight that we're gonna talk about, then we certainly can talk about that. So I want to,
Sorry, wait a minute, well, one quick question, the only thing was, and I actually think it was Sarah that found it, were some of the legal documents, you say it becomes the successor. I think the only question is then we probably need to look into is do they become a successor to the property interests? So the actual property is in the name, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, housing authority folks, it's the property is in the name of the housing authority. So we'd have to transfer property or?
That's not a question that we had the opportunity to look at. yet,
I know,
but we
that's why I'm
certainly
adding it,
will.
I'm adding it to the list. I knew you didn't have, I saw the emails and I know Christiana is turkey hunting and my joke was we were gobbling up her time. Yes, but in any rate, yes, I know you didn't have time to look into it. I was actually really impressed that you got as much information as you took, but I think that's something we should just be on the list.
Yeah, well, definitely will. And as Mike was saying, there's no switch that's being flipped. There is a process to establish the multi-jurisdictional housing authority. So until that process is implemented and starts going, that's when we'll start answering these questions. And then part of it will be the city's feedback as to whether they want to continue the existing housing authority, or if once the multi-jurisdictional one comes into play, whether it will dissolve. And in that instance, obviously then the property would transfer, but if it's going to continue to exist, if it's in that name, that's a good question as to whether they're able to continue. So and that was a question needed, I think Christiana and I knew whether, because she was like, I know they managed that property, but we weren't sure who actually owned it. So it is the current housing authority that owns it?
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up. I believe, because you actually were the ones who found some of the documents at the recorder's office, remember? So I'm trying to pull those up. I think that is the case. That the property is not in the name of the city, but it's potentially held by the property owner. But that's why that's why we have computers.
You could ask Adam, he's been on the board for 20 years.
Yeah, so, Adam, yeah.
Really
Adam,
coming
I
out
don't
of
know
your
if you know.
head.
I don't know.
You don't know?
I've been on
Okay,
there for
that makes me
60
feel
years.
better that somebody.
The internet knows.
Yeah, our understanding is that yes, it's owned by us, and we have a contract with management company that manages it sort of on our behalf. We've had employees that have been employees of the housing authority, and more recently they've become employees of the management company that runs it on our behalf. So just that was another thing, Chris. I think we always went into this with the idea that we would be dissolving each reform. As a multi-jurisdictional, we understood that would be something that would happen sort of mechanically, but we don't really have a dog in the fight at this point. Because our main thing is we need to exist and be able to provide services that we already provide.
Right, okay, well, we'll look at that. I'll try to see if we can get Sarah, if you have documents.
I just found it, yeah. it's the-
Forgive me if I was copied.
And didn't it transfer like or something? I think it transferred.
Okay,
That's
yeah,
the
we're thinking.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, that's something we don't have to necessarily answer tonight. Lori, thank you for putting that on our radar, so we can do that.
Okay, so I wanted to touch on, so we had 3 meetings, which is lightning speed to establish a regional housing authority. I can tell you that this is lightning speed because it took years to establish lots of regional housing authorities around different valleys here. A couple of things I'll get into in a little bit of why this is even possible, and a lot of it is because of the work of the Housing Coalition and all the planning that has gone into all of these discussions for the last 3 years, that the council and the BOCC is in a position to make kind of fast considerations because you have the data in front of you, you know how big of a need this is, and also you've gotten the feedback from the community through the advocacy efforts of the Housing Coalition. And so that is why we're able to do this. I'm still not going to commit to that. We're going to get to on May 19th a consensus, and we're going to have the attorneys drafting bylaws for adoption in June. But I am very, very optimistic that we can do that. But I do want to compliment everyone because we got enough information on the who qualifies at the last meeting. We got great feedback on the tier system that I think we can present, which was a great compromise. Cisco, thank you for doing the hard work on that. You know, we solved the really hard questions, but we didn't get to how will they be administered, and that's tonight. Our goal tonight with this kind of draft org chart, which is very blank. There's actually, I did a kind of a sample, half sample one, and then a blank one in case people get real creative tonight. Is that by getting an org chart, that should give us enough information for us to start to put together draft bylaws. The meeting on the 19th will be the opportunity to come back and really kind of hammer out these kind of last sticking points. And if we need to go into June and do another meeting, we'll do that. There's no point in rushing this. And I will say that, you know, as unfortunate as that interpretation is, what it does do is it creates a space in which the council and the BOCC have a lot of things under statute to consider of how to start with a blank slate. There's a lot of powers under a multi-jurisdictional housing authority that you can grant that we'll get into that could actually be legacy for solving the massive issues that you guys face. This is kind of funny because I just happened to move like the last class of the master's was like, I don't know why I even chose it, was like how to form a nonprofit board. And sure as heck, last week was this like lecture on like how to go through how to set up a new board and go through this generative strategic fiduciary like flow of things. I'm like, well, we're doing this really fast because this was like a 2-year like how to go through the formation of a nonprofit board. And this is obviously a little bit different than a nonprofit board, but this applies. What I wanted to point out is that, you know, there are some really critical things that as you go through like creating a mission and how you're going to service the community and where you start. Where I was really taken back is that a lot of the strategic thinking, and if you think about the strategic housing plan that was done and all the other planning work that's done, there's been a lot of thought process in the middle here. What I'm asking for today is for us to take a step back and go slow down to go fast again. And going back to the generative thinking, which is thinking about holistically, what is the big mission at hand? How do we create a board that is able to direct and service the community which it represents? And that is really the focus of tonight. And then the final thing is, and Commissioner Fiedler brought it up, was like, well, how are we gonna pay for all of this? And that's really important because we wanted to enable through the creation in the bylaws, there are revenue producing ways under statute that your new board could take on that fiduciary responsibility for all these things you want to do. And so I just wanted everyone to, you know, I just had to laugh this week when I was sitting there watching my online video. I was like, oh, here we go. Of course, how did that work out? But does that make sense to everyone on how, and I also wanted this, sorry, go back to that one last time. We would never be able to go this fast had we, you know, I'm working with other communities. They don't have a planning in place. And so we're starting with needs assessments and starting from the ground up. We are 6 months into certain processes and we're not anywhere close to talking about having the a council and a BOC sit down and talking about how we long-term solve a problem with board creation. So I applaud, you know, the efforts of everyone to getting here. You know, the one thing I'll say, you know, why do this? The easy answer for me is that, do we want to meet with 10 individuals every time we want to have a housing discussion and take up an hour of your agendas? What you're really doing is enabling a board to actually have a singular focus every time they meet, which is affordable housing. That is really how I look at it. This is why you should do this. Beyond that, though, is powers in the statute. It's also looking at how you guys can leverage your assets. Obviously, working together, you have more assets than working alone as a county and a city. But those are really, to me, it's like, let's make your meetings attainable when you actually meet as councils and VOCCs, and let's have recommendations coming from a group that's solely focused on that. Again, the duplication of efforts, I think is a really another big one. Time is money, in my opinion. When you sit down and you have meetings, let's try to make these meetings as pointed as possible moving forward. And then the other last thing is that, if this is something that the VOCC and council choose, you have the ability to develop projects and develop public assets, which we've identified. And there's a lot more of them out there, but we identified 3 that we're looking at through the charrette process as part of this. So this is kind of kicking off into this next slide, which is this blank, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. But I want to impress upon the council and the VOCC, when you think about these flow charts, and we're going to add not names, but we're going to add entities or interest groups or community member groups to who we think the board makes up. Let's not lose sight of a really productive board is one that actually represents the community they serve, right? They also need to represent the council and the city's interest and the county's interest, obviously, but there also needs to be more board members and there's the ability to also create committees that also function and provide input into this whole process. And I think that's really important in making sure that, especially like something like, dare I say, if there's ever a tax initiative that comes up, having interests from other entities besides the city and county on your board allows advocates for those type of things. If there's a program like that we decide that is needed, having people on your board that can relate to your program recipients is huge. So let's make sure that we don't lose track of that. Losing track of the business community, The one funny thing that came out of this class was basically the last thing another board needs is another Michael Yerman, like a guy who sits on it. I think we all know what that means. It's we need representation of who is going to be served by that board. So as we kind of go through that, you'll see a lot of blanks, and I'll explain how this all works, puts together. That's really kind of the thought process that we're working towards. So I want to start with, and this kind of fills out as we answer these questions. But first, I want to start talking about the inclusivity of a new board. And that is on this sheet here, that's this top corner. Well, what our goal is. Sorry, are there more of those? There absolutely.
I have 2 over here.
Well, there's one that has all blank committees, and there's one in your packet that has some committees filled in.
Oh, they're in tax points.
Yep, it should all be in your packet. If we hit basically the one with committees ideas on it, I put on there in case we just hit like a writer's block and we keep this meeting moving. But I would encourage you can certainly start with your blank committee sheet. But I want to start with so when you look at this, obviously in the middle or at the very top, you have your Regional Housing Authority Board, which is the board, and as an org chart, everyone reports to the board, right? On your right side, though, is your board members. I don't want names, please, no one put names on their list. What I'm looking for on the right side, and this is kind of an open dialogue, so please throw things out. Jackie and I are recording this. My goal at the end of this meeting is for us to have one master copy that Jackie takes back and that we bring back to the meeting of here's the list of the organizations and committees that the council felt were important to have in the bylaws. What that does is it allows Chris and I and Jackie to create bylaws that will have the boards and all the minutia that is the legal backbone of a new housing. So starting with the board, obviously the obvious 2 members of a regional housing board are a city representative and a county representative. So we could probably start there, right? It would be kind of silly not to have a city and county rep. But the other question becomes do the city and county, Jackie is a staff of 1. When I asked city and county, is there any reason to have, and we did this on a regional housing authority board that I serve, we had staff that were non-voting members from city and county. And does that make sense as an appointee is to have staff in city and county non-voting members? Does it make sense to have additional city and county voting members? I want to start there because that's kind of the easy low hanging. I'll open it up there.
we start with, what's the most effective number of board members? You have 9 spaces here, because it seems to me that the bigger the board, the more unwieldy it becomes.
Sure.
I wonder if 7 isn't a more effective number.
That
Well, I
is,
think too, if you get too many board members, it's hard to get a meeting time scheduled, right?
Yeah.
So that might be a good point too.
and you can always remember too, that the way I'm envisioning is that you have committees as well that will have their own sub meetings. But you're right, the board ultimately,
I'm watching all the city council people backpedaling right now.
no, I think that's a great question. I purposely put 9 on here. I will say that most functional boards have 7. And so is 7 a reasonable number to start with?
Should start with that.
Okay.
My input this early on would be that there should be only one person representing like the city or the county, and having, it's a true collaborative process. When everybody sits down, they should be equal, shared steward, shared leadership through this regional housing authority board. And so I don't think we need to weight it with an additional city representative. Right? At least from my perspective.
What about staff? You want staff to be able to attend as non-voting board members?
What are the considerations of that? Like, what are the pros and cons either way?
Sure, that's a great question. I served on a regional housing authority board as staff as a non-voting member. I was able to bring practical knowledge of zoning codes and things around development aspects, so that it wasn't like, oh, we'll go back and ask Michael when we get back to the office. And we were able to have real-time answers. Also,
And who were you the staff of? at
I
the
was
time?
staff of the town of Crescent Butte, serving on a regional housing.
Okay,
because
not a staff of the housing authority.
Yes.
Okay.
But this town of Crescent Butte had, actually on that board had 2 voting members. So I was a non-voting.
Okay.
But that's the advantage of staff. And it, yes, Jeff?
Oh, sure.
Well, the only thing else I'd add is that obviously they're public meetings, so it doesn't preclude staff from coming. So to keep that open too.
Michael, I do have just a question, because there is a lot of folks that wear multiple hats, right? Is there ever an opportunity that there's an alternate? If, let's say, the city representative that they cannot attend, can you actually have somebody in their stead still having that voting power if there was something coming? Is there such a,
Yes,
way of
you
doing that?
can certainly do alternate members. And one thing that I would, if you do one consideration of why to do alternate members is that because the city and county have such an integral role in this, that you might even put in there that it's not a quorum without both the city and county representatives being present, and therefore you could create an alternative position to make sure you always have a quorum.
I think my question is, are these board members elected by the community, like the school board, or are they appointed?
They're all
Appointed
board,
by who?
well, that's a great question. My suggestion is that obviously you're not gonna do that, without, that they would be appointed by the BOCC and the council of the board.
Yeah, I started on my list, school district, land use, C4, DHS, aging health coordinator.
You gotta get slower for us.
And,
So school district, let's start with school district. There's a great list, but I want to kind of vet each one of those real quick. And you guys can do simple, like, and there's no, like, we're only looking for 7 here. We can do 9 and then we can bring it back to the next meeting and pare it down. And we can also look at if there's commonalities, like, I don't know, like firefighter and police officer, emergency services is how you narrow it down. So, but let's just do simple with this, to keep this kind of moving forward. Where's that yes, maybe, no from the council on, so we'll start with school district representation on this board. Yes, maybe, no. Maybe, yes, okay.
I just want to hear what other
Sure.
ideas are. I mean, I think I would love all those lists, but I just want to see like what.
Sure.
we end up
well, I
with.
think like the school district, I'm thinking of the representation of the community. So I'm thinking families, youth, And DHS, I'm thinking goes like need and benefits, low income, goes C4, I'm thinking of organization that is offering some sort of housing support program, aging welfare for seniors and.
So just on the, if you settle on the number 7, depending on who the first 4 board members are, it is also often common that once those first appointed board members, so the ones from the city and the county were put in place, then that next generation would be appointed by the board. So it takes the politics out of it from the city or the county side. And then any of those people would be replaced by an action of the board, with the exception of the appointed person by the city or the appointed person by the county. So then you have those sort of at-large members, but they're actually selected by the members of the board of directors of the authority rather than the city. And that sort of takes a little bit of the political edge off of the decision-making and creates a little more independence in the board.
And
Just as
that,
an
and that,
alternative idea.
and Jan, that's a great idea. And to add to that, a lot of the time though, and you correct me if I'm wrong, there is a little bit of a bracket around who that appointee could become. They're like, they should represent this segment. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there could be some policies in place on sort of where those people should come from, or that would be something that would come as part of the housing conversations with them.
I think the only downside of that is if you get a board that has a certain, I don't know, political leading or an agenda, that they could actually just replace board members and have a majority of whatever that outlook is, and then you would never be able to have a balanced vote. Does that make sense?
But
The
the
only-
original 4 are the political appointees.
Yeah, so you'd
The
have,
original
so
4?
it'd be 2 and 2.
Oh, I didn't realize it was
And then
2.
you'd have 3.
Oh, gotcha.
would be
I thought you were
the-
saying 1.
Yeah, no, I think that's what Max had said. I'm sorry, I
Gotcha.
tried to clarify that. It would be 2 and 2, and then your 3 would be appointed by the 4.
I understand.
So the city kind of always retain.
Yeah.
For their appointees.
Right.
So let's rehash that. So if I'm hearing you guys right, what they're suggesting is that the city and county would actually have 2 members. One would be from both the city and county would be at large. So you'd have 1 elected and then 1 appointed at large.
Correct.
And so the city and county would each have a vote on who they want to appoint to your at large membership. And then the 4 members would vote on the last 3 members of the.
To me, that would be an ideal setup, but that's just my thoughts.
Can I ask the housing coalition to remind me what their boards, because I gave you have a good like representation breakdown. So not to like lose you on the spot. Well, or housing authority, I don't know if housing authority is broken down by representation, but I
So
know, yeah.
the coalition requires at least 1 homeowner, at least 1 renter. And then from the other 7, it can be from various buckets, including like industry experts, and community members. Some of the industry experts that we called out was the school district, local employers, financial or title, property management or realty.
Okay, thanks, just helpful to.
Sure.
And construction.
And one of the, and so those are great lists. And one thing I'll add to that is that you'll see here too, that once we start going through committees, it's a lot of those, a lot of like that back end of that list would be really ideal for potentially development committee. If, you know, we had one of those that kind of spearheaded, and I'll get into some of the nuances around not having elected officials on the development committee, because ultimately you're in a quasi judicial capacity after if it comes forward, right? But we'll get into that here in a minute. So let me ask this. So that was great feedback. So if we started with the concept of 7 members, so it seemed like there was some consensus there. This is going great, by the way. So fast. None of us would take an hour itself. We had 7 members, 2 at large from, or one elected on each side, 1 at large from each side. So that's 4. And then basically we created a menu of options that the 3 at large members that are appointed by the board would represent. And we have a kind of a running list here. So we started with the school district. We had homeowner, renter. We had real estate, community, construction industry. developer. And who else am I missing? Title,
Title, finance.
finance is a really good one, actually. What about community members?
Before we go on, I want to thank the folks who have included the school district. But I need to make it clear that this is not something the school board has discussed and doesn't have a position on. And as the lone out of meeting school board member here, I'm just going to be quiet. So my quietness does not indicate disapproval or approval. It's not my place to speak here.
That's no problem. Thank you. Any other industry experts that, what about, so these are good industry. What about the folks that live in the housing? How do we represent them? I mean, there's nothing worse than like building houses and then realizing you built the houses for the wrong people, right? How do we ensure that we're servicing the folks that are housing insecure, that need housing? What are those groups? Seniors?
Let's say retail worker or service worker.
Service industry. That's good. And this is, like I said, this is a brainstorm here, so it's okay to have a giant list up here. We can-
Well, at first this would be hard, but at some point it could be someone who lives in or has lived in the properties that we would be overseeing.
a current tenant
Yeah.
or property owner of a deed restricted house. Yeah.
Is there typically, there's a tenant association form? I mean, I wonder if there's like a.
I think it's a good idea, except if you don't have any properties, but yes, yeah, but yes, no, I think longer, yes, but no, it's a great idea.
Somebody on Zoom.
Yeah.
I
someone on
think
Zoom.
Sarah was trying to bring this up earlier, but like a direct service worker of some sort. A direct service worker involved in housing. I don't know how we would quantify that, but
Okay. I don't actually know what that means. Is that
Was he
someone
talking
else?
about property management?
Like DHS or.
someone who's helping with rental assistance or
Gotcha.
Oh,
connecting
okay.
people to resources, to rental assistance. So anyone who worked in like the UNC, anyone from C4, who works with utility assistance, so on and so forth.
Don't know how to write that.
That would be, it'd be like someone like a Jackie.
I would probably, you could probably put like rental assistance.
Yeah.
Services.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rental services.
Yeah.
So that's a great list. And so the one other big thing and I'm gonna divert us from this thought process into now start talking about this, but before I leave this, because I want to keep us on track today, because we have a lot to cover in an hour next. But I wanted to surmise this for just a real quick of what I've heard. So we're talking about potentially 7 members, and again, there's none of this is set in stone. We're talking about 7 members, 4 of which would be basically come out of 2 from the city, 2 from the county through your appointments. And we'd have 3 at-large members. We can define the 3 at-large members in a little bit. The only thing I would ask is term limits or term durations. The one thing that I think anybody who's ever served on a board is that if you never see turnover on a board, you never get penalized for this. I think it's less, the term limits are probably a little less of an issue for the two appointed positions in the city and county, because you guys would have the authority as a council to just basically exchange a member as you see fit, right? Because you could vote at any point to do that, but it's really those 3 members. Does it seem right to make those 3 at-large appointments 2 years, 3 years, or 4-year terms?
It might be helpful if you want, but Adam's been on the housing authority board for 17 years, and he can speak to like how many people have volunteered to be on that board, and how easy it is to recruit. Which will probably change, right, with the housing authority growing and being more powerful in the city and kind of being more involved in helping recruit folks, but it hasn't historically been like an easy board to fill.
You enjoyed your 17 years?
Well, we only met quarterly. For forever until a couple of years ago. We started, well, a year and a half ago, we started meeting monthly. But I could tell you the first 10 years that I was on that board, city councils and mayors came and went, and no one even knew we existed at the city level, even though we were created by the city housing authority and we were self-governing, but no one even knew that we belonged to the city.
Stan should get the award. He's the truth of it. We're holding it together for 17 years.
So we could have, so not having we could have length of terms, but if we didn't put term limits on, that would allow people to continue if there's not a ample supply of interested parties.
That's exactly where I was
And
going.
Lake County and Leadville is full of open board positions. And so I think that would be wise to not put term limits on it.
But would we want 2, 3, 4 years? That's really the question. I love that idea.
I like the idea of 2 because it gives people flexibility to be done if that's the right choice for them, but.
Could we do it somewhat similar to how we have like planning commission set up with staggered terms, so that there's not mass turnover at one time? And the
That's a
potential
really
for
nice
a slew of openings
Yeah.
of board seats at one time
That's a
that
good
we
way
may
to keep
not all
the
want to be.
institutional knowledge rolling.
Yeah,
So we could start with a 2, 3, and 4 year term, and then we could go to 2-year terms after the first term. That sound like a reasonable way to go about it? So the first appointments would be a 2, a 3, and a 4-year term. So the 3 appointees, one person will get a 4-year term, one person will get a 3-year term, one person will get a 2-year term. And then obviously, as their term comes up, they can either reapply and continue on, or someone else can apply and or could then consider the applicants for that one position. But that way, then you don't have that, and then obviously after that, you have staggered years of people going on.
So for clarification with the city and county representatives too, it would be the position, not the people, right? So that, because I'm thinking of with the different terms of our elected officials and stuff, that if you had somebody who came in the middle of their elected term and started at a 4-year term, they might not finish that term.
Correct.
So it's the position, not the person.
Yes. Yeah, and what I think the requirement would be that you're an act for the, especially the 2 electeds, you actually have to be served. You
Yeah.
couldn't carry on.
Oh, yeah.
Great question. Okay. I'm gonna stop it there because we could get into really into like the rabbit hole and never come out. We'd be in Wonderland forever. Because we have a lot of other questions that I want to talk about, but then we'll come back to the flow chart here again. So if you go to your sheet, the second question in here, and I want to go through it. And this is, again, this is a thumbs up, thumbs down, but then we're gonna go through this rapid fire, and I apologize for the bigger discussion. And we can certainly stop and talk about these as needed. But these are kind of the high level duties that you could consider for a regional housing board. You, as the council and the VOCC, have the ability to limit these, and we'll get into that, the actual statute here in a little bit. But the first one on here is administration of housing programs. I would assume that would probably be a priority of a housing board. Thumbs up, need them, no. Okay, we'll put a check mark next to that. This one's a big one, development of property. Going into property development is kind of a big step. The alternative and the pro of this is that you, as municipalities and public agencies like the school district, for instance, own public assets that would be ideal for housing. And that is a reason to potentially venture into that space. A reason not to is that it's very time consumptive and takes a lot of resources. But I don't see the private sector jumping up and down to do that. So I would think that that's something that we would want to consider, but that's up to that. Yeah, Dan?
And just to add a little bit of color, that could also be the auspice of just being an equity partner in some other developers' project. So if a developer comes in and wants to do affordable housing, one of the things that the housing authority would avail them the ability to do is become a 0.1% partner in the project. And then that gives them special tax breaks on materials, construction, labor, all of those things. And that's going to be a key component of being able, of the housing authority. It's one of the biggest full purposes of having a housing authority. So under that, I think that those two pieces sort of development of property, there's a big scary one that's where you're actually going out and building it, the authority. And then there's the less scary one where we're the development partner, but we would still want to sort of caveat it to say, yes, we are developing housing programs as an equity partner to a larger developer who would come with some of that. So just kind of a little caveat there.
Would a better word be spearheading development?
I think I had a question like that. It's like, I mean, you're not gonna have like an in-house general contractor.
Yeah.
I mean, you would always be around. Probably you have the authority to do it, but you would contract out with another rep.
We want to be really heavy on the board construction side. No, but in all honesty, yeah, you're right, John. It's really the development. For instance, it's what you would be doing is authorizing the regional housing authority to leverage public land assets to have housing. And so they would oversee RFQ selection, negotiate deals, and also do what they just described as public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing some general, that's a good thought process. Okay,
Thumbs up on Zoom.
thank you. Management of housing properties. So this is a great one in talking about how we opened the meeting of how we could continue to operate with the existing housing authority. And I think that's probably, that's a staff intensive piece of the puzzle. And so that's probably the biggest consideration is that if you're going to manage property, you're going to have the staff to do that. But I think this one, in the way we open the meeting, this is one that needs further investigation, i.e. how do we work with the existing housing authority? Is that kind of a good way of summarizing that for now?
Having the authority and the power to manage housing properties doesn't mean that the staff of the housing authority have to manage those properties. They can contract that out to a third-party management company, right? So, which is what the housing authority is currently doing. So having those powers doesn't necessarily mean that we have to rapidly grow the housing authority itself, which is the big
And having just gone through many hundreds of existing, over in some county where I work, many hundreds of existing deed restrictions, I might even suggest you want to do that rather than have an actual staff person trying to track that down. And now is the time to sort of make those decisions because we've got 30 million different structures that we're chasing on as they happen sort of through time. Deciding now on the funding now is probably pretty important.
Just throw out, the city just purchased a house, it might be advantageous for them to have an opportunity to get that managed by the authority that they already oversee.
Yep, okay.
We haven't bought it yet. You're under contract. Closes hopefully May 16th.
Yeah.
All right, those are all great comments, things to consider. So thumbs up. Authority to administer housing guidelines, which is a big blank in all of our housing documents. So Jackie would love to get a thumbs up on that one today. I think that's probably, yes. Okay, now this one's a good one, is independently oversee your own finances. And this one is kind of a really sticky one in the bylaws, as Chris probably attests to, because is it going to be, the question here would our new regional housing authority have its own separate bank account in which it operates under, or would it operate through a county fund or a city fund? And again, as a board, one of the big fiduciary responsibilities you would have is overseeing that budget. I can give you an example of the independent one is that basically the Regional Housing Authority operates from dues from the membership from the two city and county. And then also brings in separate revenues through programming fees, there was a small percentage that when we did do for sale product, they did the loan process and the closing and everything, and they got a small fee. And that helped build that, as well as when you actually go out for a lot of the programming, which we'll get into that are out there through state grants and program housing grants, there's sometimes administrative costs that come with the initial grant award, but that would have to live in a budget within the Regional Housing Authority. I don't know if that's enough information to make an informed decision tonight, but it is an important piece of how we draft the actual regulations. Does that make sense? Questions?
Can we? Sorry, can the city and county, could we keep the oversight of the finances really just practical reasons and then authorize that 2 years down the road once we're sort of got some activity under our belt?
I think that's something we'd have to take a little bit of investigation and drafting. Yeah. It's gonna be a sticking point of how you're financially set up because of audit and everything else.
Yeah, because it does, once you establish the housing, it is a separate entity.
Yeah.
And so trying to do that in-house in the county or the city or something could be an issue.
So it would be
I
treated
would-
similar to like the Lura board, right? Like where we would have our own bank account, our own treasurer, and we would then report back to those entities, like the county and the city on like a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
Looked like Tim Burke, maybe had a chat question.
Oh.
It was pretty extensive.
He said, yeah.
That was extensive. I couldn't quite read it.
Should the budget be set and then grow because of startup funds coming from the city and county? Get out of my head, Jeff. Great comment. Yeah, I think on that one, let's let I think it's a really an important legal question of how the audit would work. I am horrible with Excel spreadsheets, so I'm not the person to ask. You get my drift, but we can dig into that. I got a note to that on that one. Moving ahead, right, receive, leverage state and federal funds to grants or other programs.
Yes.
We're just talking about how limited the funds already are, so, okay. Land banking and holding public property. That one is probably a pretty important one, especially as it relates to potential the city. So yes.
Yeah, there's issues with cities and counties giving away land, so I think they do have to be able to.
And I'm gonna go.
It has to be there is a transfer type process, and that's one thing I've started looking into is what that will require, and what the structure might be for that.
The one question I have around this one, because I've seen this is actually like a powder keg type of political type of issue, is that, for instance, you could have a property that was controlled by the county that the board decides to develop. The county, two representatives of the county say, no, we want to do something different, blah, blah, blah. And they're out and voted. Do we feel like, as a safety check on this, that there needs to be a majority consensus of the 4 appointed board members by the city and county on the basically development of publicly owned assets? Because that is a powder keg. It's easier to have that conversation like now when it's not on the table. than
Well,
when
are you
it's-
talking about the housing authority condemning?
No, that's a whole different thing we'll get into.
Because they have the power to develop public properties, doesn't
Right.
mean they hold those public.
I'm gonna
properties.
I'm gonna try to make this a very vague example because of where I came from. It's because I point to a really specific example where this became a huge disaster. Kind of it really pitted members of the board against each other. What can happen is as you develop a piece of property, there could be NIMBYs that come out and say, I don't want that in my backyard, blah, 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 and they get to a board member or or an elected official, and all of a sudden you're, as a board member, you're saying, we're not gonna move forward with development of the property, you get outvoted. Now you're an outspoken person on the board, and it was something that, for instance, maybe the 2 county representatives was a county property, the 2 county representatives are outvoted by the other 5 members of the board to move forward with the development of that property, and the concerns of the county haven't been met. And my point to bringing this up is that if you put in the governors now, it's a much easier way of saying it requires a unanimous vote of the 4 appointed officials to move forward with the development of a public asset.
But then you don't have fair representation on the board,
That, you're correct, Dan.
which is no bueno.
I think, but so Gunnison, I think, had an example in there, and to go out for a tax levy or make some of those big decisions. All the jurisdictions of the authority, their boards had to approve those moves. I think there are some of those things that we should have in place.
And that's getting into revenue, but we're getting back into, so that's a great good example. We can talk about revenue here too. That's the other power thing. Going back to the property. Again, what's gonna happen if we put this board in a position to develop public property, this board will be the decision-making body. As elected officials, as you know, because you've handled land use applications, as an elected official, once that application comes forward, you are in a quasi judicial capacity and you're a voting member on the land use decision. That board, though, as they bring the development application, is basically the applicant to the application. What I'm bringing up here is there anything that we want to discuss now about the power of the board on bringing those, and whether or not it requires like a supermajority vote or something beyond a simple majority to leverage a public asset? Sure.
So that, in that example, say that property is county owned, wouldn't the commissioners be the ones to decide if it could be developed or not?
It would have been previously owned by the county. It would have been transferred to
And then
them.
give
So,
them,
So the decision to transfer it would have been. the
Already
decision of the
made.
board.
yes.
But-
okay.
but then-
But then we wouldn't have the authority to say, more X amount of units for our staff, or like county essential service workers. That authority would then be transferred to the housing authority, correct?
And that's my point here again goes to this is where, again, I'm identifying a political hot flash 2 years down the road.
Yeah, I mean, to Kayla's question, you would write whatever it is that you want as part of the transfer of the property, and then that would then become what would need to happen on that piece of property. I mean, this is a good thought experiment, but it sounds more like a power play to me than, if all of the other steps have been put in place ahead of this, it shouldn't happen. I mean, I can see that it can and it does, but something somewhere prior to that didn't get worked out appropriately through the development process. And I would rather talk about those guardrails than creating a dispersed power structure.
What about, and EOCC changes
Yeah,
hands,
Yeah.
and then you get.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, in that, yeah, I think that's another great, okay, so the land transfer happens, the GeoCC changes, and now they don't want to do it, they get cold feet, so they're gonna try to pull the property back. And that board member changes, so be it. The decision was made when it was made, and, we've got to have some continuity if we want to get things like this done in our communities.
that's why I think there is a specific transfer process where that legal ownership transfers over. And so that you don't have that risk of subsequent board members
Clawback, yeah.
deciding something different. with it.
So, yeah, so does that, Chris, if I'm understanding, where is the best place to sort of handle that? Is it in the power of the board, or is it in making sure the process is set up correctly?
When you say that, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I mean, in terms of the transfer, there's a whole process that the board, like if it's county property, the BOCC will have to go through this process and the analysis, and the final resolution approving the transfer will have to tick all those boxes in terms of in the best public interest, and that it's not something that will be used like for property that they're transferring, that it's not something that would be viable really for a future county project. So it has to be something that's truly not gonna be needed by the county for something else.
And you would get to negotiate your, like, how many houses you got for your county employees or.
Yeah, transfer stuff, it'll be what terms in terms of the property, so it'd be what terms the county decides it wants to transfer the property.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, that's a pretty solvable.
Yeah.
And that's in fact the protection, not a unequal power balance on the board. And, you know, that's my thought.
It's your guys' board. I'm just telling you, I'm bringing up, there's this is one other example I'm bringing up that I've seen where you have a dysfunctional board because of that.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly okay with it being a simple majority, but I'm glad you guys are having a chance to think this through.
I don't think I'd want to elevate certain board members to have more.
That's great.
And it does seem to highlight the importance of this authority being able to hold the relevant properties, right?
Yeah.
It is, even, once it's established, it is a separate entity. It's not an entity that is subservient to either the city or the county. It is a separate entity unto itself.
And it comes, again, there is a stigma around affordable housing. And as folks who sit on land use decision application, there's a reason that this board sets aside from being, in the elected, because you are the applicant, right? You are putting forward potentially an application with, obviously with a developer selected. There will be NIMBYism that comes along with these types of projects, and
And you just need to read today's paper.
It was, some of the comments were very nasty.
Yeah. And again, that's why I bring this up, because this is a powder keg. This is where the rubber hits the road as political bodies that you have made a tough decision to move forward with a project. Okay, so I love the comments. Glad we talked about it. This is what I'm trying to.
So EOCC and city council have to do their due diligence before they turn over anything.
Yeah, you can't call it back playing games on the housing authority board.
Love it. Set policies and make recommendations for future housing solutions. This kind of gets into like the PAC, right? Like what the PAC has been doing. And a role for, how we work with the PAC or this, but I think this is something that as these types of projects and stuff move forward, that we want this to continue to look at. Okay, so head nods, yes. All right. The last one. So this is the other powder keg. This is create additional dedicated revenue sources for housing. So in the long run, there are a regional housing authority does have taxing authority if you give them taxing authority. That is a big one. Obviously, and I think a lot of considerations need to go into that because there's three basic ways. There's a percent sales tax, there's a 5 mil property tax that's available, and a $2 value use tax that is available to a housing authority. Per square foot. This one in particular is the other powder keg issue in that the regional housing authority can put forward the ballot initiative, but the electeds could basically pass resolution saying we don't support it. It will still wind up. Go ahead.
Do you have to decide that when you're creating a housing authority, or is that something you can do? I know that housing authority, they have powers, but I don't know that you have to exercise all of the authority that you have. When you create, so you can create the body and they can decide at some later point to do a revenue. Is that correct?
The question so I understand your question. The question, this is a legal question. I don't, not put you on the spot today. The answer is not gonna.
You can put me on the spot, I'll just be like,
Nope.
I'll get back to you.
No, she's like, Demmer, invite Lori to another meeting.
No, I don't, this is this is a legal answer. My quick answer to you is, I believe that the founding bylaws have to address whether or not they can, whether the question becomes whether or not the bylaws can be amended at a future date to allow taxing authority is a whole different, is a different legal question. So, but my gut tells me that the way the statute's written is that the bylaws should probably address it up front.
It will, yeah, but and just speaking without any review at all, that my concern would be if anything that would trigger taxing authority would have to go to the voters.
Yeah, 100%.
So, you know, that's. You're 100% right there, because I know that's a fact. What it is the authorization to put it on the ballot. Oh.
So so they're not able to, a housing authority can't say we're doing a 1% sales tax. Thank you,
Right.
everyone.
Yeah.
No, you're right there. What they can do is authorize, put it on the ballot. So that's the fundamental thing is, obviously, there's a lot of like property tax is the best example. You have other districts that rely heavily on property taxes, school district, fire district, hospital district, for instance, that really rely on those. And giving, and I believe, because this is what I'm not 100% on this, but I'm 90% sure, you could actually take away, for instance, the ability for a property tax and say this housing authority, if it ever goes to the ballot, could only do a sales tax or a excise tax, or excise assessment.
But you have to do,
But it has to go to
it has, there's reading in the statute for interpretation maybe, but I thought that it said, in order to levy a mill levy, you also have to institute a sales tax or a transfer tax. Like you have, it sounded like the housing authority had to do
One of the two.
both, two of the three
Two of the three.
in order to then.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, let's bookmark this one, because this is a huge one. But
let's do what with this?
Bookmark it.
Oh.
bookmark it. But I mean, please-
And that's where in this example, it's like, you shall do this upon authority of like all the local jurisdictions. Concurrence of all the participating local government jurisdictions.
I want to do one more temperature check on this one though. Just because this is a really big one, and just to see where the north arrow, because again, you can limit the powers or not. Is this something that the council and BOCC would even want to even consider moving forward with? And if so, we will do more investigation on what exact taxes and et cetera.
I just answered my own question.
Thank you.
The statute says, so this is the state statute that Chris was referencing, and it says you basically, any jurisdictions can contract to create a regional housing authority, and it says any contract establishing any such authority shall specify, it lists a bunch of things. And then in paragraph E, it says the expected sources of revenue of the authority and any requirements that contracting member governments consent to the levying of any taxes or development impact fees and within the jurisdiction of such members. So it sounds like you have to put it in the formation.
That's
So,
yeah.
and then I didn't read fast enough, but I think it answers your question. If you want me to send it to you, it does answer the question about what you can.
What you have to wait.
Yeah, you have to adopt a resolution, but it doesn't. I don't think it says you have to levy one and then another, but I can send it.
So,
Let
go ahead.
me-
Sure.
My personal opinion is that this is an extremely political issue and that's gonna be taken by the public very negatively. And if all of those same things can be put in place to a ballot by city council or the board, BOCC, I think that's the route it should go. Because I can just see the letters to the paper saying, oh, they're gonna tax us or raise our property taxes and we can't do anything about it. They're not elected and I
Oh,
just,
the housing authority, okay.
I just think it's not gonna be received well.
And that's a great comment, but I want to make sure that all this goes to a vote regardless. It's just a matter of putting it for the voters, but yes.
Yeah.
I
So one of the other things is it's not just gonna be limited to taxes. It's also gonna include things like property management fees, any income from rental, those kinds of things. So sort of think broadly across what all of those things could be. If you have a housing authority that is supposed to manage property but can't collect the rents from them, that can be, problematic. So that, I think there needs to be something in the bylaws to that. How broadly would, council and GOCC need to sort of figure that out. You can also put it all in and then, with your representation on the board, then decide how to do that. Takes a little bit more coordination between the two jurisdictions to make sure that they're, sort of lined up policy-wise in the direction they're giving to the board members that they've got seated on the housing authority board. But think broadly, my only thing is to think broadly, because it's not just taxes, it's not just levies, it is in fact other forms of income.
Yes,
management
any
fees.
revenue.
Yeah, revenue, period, yeah.
And I think on any other forms of revenue, I think I'm focusing on taxes, but I would assume that you guys would have no issues with taking on other forms of revenue, like your programs and what Dan, that's done.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing it up. That's really
I
important.
like the idea of them being able to bring it to Congress. Because I feel like we're hamstringing the authority if we don't give them that tool to potentially pursue funding.
I would tend to agree with Cisco.
Well, let's do this. I understand the comments on that. There's some really important conversations. I already kind of knew that this was gonna need to have further investigation. And I think, between Chris and I and bringing back exactly how that would function and work is very important to making sure you guys make a clear decision on that. Would certainly be that piece of I could certainly see this being, as the bylaws come in front of the city council, in front of the BOCC, one of the major discussion points. But I do want to get into programming now. And then what we're doing on time, we're doing great. So programming.
So can I just
Sure.
throw another question in the hopper for?
Yep.
I mean, giving the housing authority the authority to generate these revenues, like going to the voters for a sales tax or property tax, that doesn't preclude the city or county from also doing that and dedicating it
Right.
to housing.
Exactly.
That's correct.
Okay, that's right.
And yes.
An example,
Could actually be a nice defer, it's the housing authority.
Well, and vice versa, like the housing authority is busy doing 10 other things first,
Exactly.
like, and for sure, yeah.
Well, as we get into the thought process, I want to get through programming, but as we get back into this, because I want to go through programming very fast, because I think this is a thumbs up, thumbs down, but as we get back into this, when you talk about tax revenue and a potential committee on like a finance committee, I mean, obviously, money dictates the scope and what this group is actually going to be achieve, because housing is very expensive. One thing I would put in there is that if you are going to consider taxing the ability for this group to tax, is that you actually have a committee that would thoroughly vet any kind of tax coming out of this group with the other taxing entities across the country. Because as we know, there are other special districts and school districts especially that rely heavily on property taxes. And again, property taxes are a really tough one because you're taxing everyone's property and making it more expensive to build housing for other people. It's less expensive. That was the argument that wound up, coming full force out of the discussion that we had in our region. But anyways, let's get into programming, and we will make sure that comes back on the 19th with some really direct answers. All right. So I'm going to go through this list because I want to spend the last half hour or 15 minutes as we can talking a little bit more about committees moving forward. First time home buyer education. Obviously, there's other entities that we can reach out to beyond the jurisdiction that this would have in partnering with Summit County or Eagle County, so that Jackie doesn't have to take on all of this programming. But I want to make sure that we discuss that these are the different programs that are out there. First time home buyer education, I would assume is something that we want to. Down payment assistance is a big one. That's actually a state program and a funding award. Energy rehab, that's an interesting one. Energy rehab is, okay, so that's a,
Take boards. Yeah, but if you have,
Partner with them.
what's that?
Partner with them.
Yeah, I was gonna say, wouldn't you like? partner with them to
Okay,
make them
I'm not
stronger?
understanding why you're putting programming into the bylaws.
it's not going to the bylaws in. This is talking about the scope of what can be accomplished.
So like any of these things could be done.
Yeah, so again, think back to the generative model here.
Yeah,
You're, as a board, you're creating a board that is going to be overseeing a staff that is carrying out all different functions of the housing authority. Obviously, you're right, Dan, the bylaws aren't gonna get into like, you're doing person. But the bigger piece of the puzzle is, if you're going to be doing all of these programs, you gotta think about funding sources, right? You gotta think about staffing, it's how big of an organization, that's why I'm trying to get you, there's a fiduciary responsibility that this new board is gonna take on. But I wanna make sure that they're not taking on a program that isn't something that is, and I think what you just brought up, C4 is already doing it, it's a redundant program. Mobile home rehab, mobile home assistance, something to look into, yes. Deed restriction purchase programs is a big one, that's a hot one. That one is like the Vale and Deed, what do they call it in Summit? The purchase program.
We've got housing helps and a bunch of different things.
Do you guys understand what those are? Okay. Is that something that you want this group to be considering? Okay. Senior housing?
As far as senior housing goes, I would like to see, in addition to that, is a program to keep seniors in their homes where they may need help. Like, if you're gonna do mobile home rehab, about senior home rehab, or I don't know what you call it.
That's a great one. Homelessness, and emergency shelter, that's a big tough one. Yes,
and emergency shelters.
Apparently, one of the churches is considering developing a shelter.
They're not just for an emergent, like a incident, but a shelter. Okay. Just wanna make sure, I was like,
Yeah.
there are plenty of.
that's something that you would see this group being involved in, okay? All right,
Is that a yes?
yes. Anything else that we're missing?
I didn't see anything in there around rentals.
There was a
Like, it all seems fairly buyer oriented.
there should have been, sorry, rental assistance should have been on this list, that's a good other. Rental assistance is, the other one that should be on here is, section 8, rental subsidies.
So.
Yep.
I guess I'm not understanding why we wouldn't, like. I think we're including like everything in the kitchen sink here so that nothing is prohibited from being leveraged through the housing authority. Why would we not put energy rehab in there? I said if we're including everything to prevent precluding anything, the housing authority being leveraged in any way, why would we not put the energy rehab in there if then they would be able to?
What
Would that
is, I don't know what C4 is.
It's a conservation center that's doing a home repair program
So,
currently through the state.
They do,
And-
energy, like efficiency, they do come in and do an assessment and then determine where.
Yeah. So what I would say then is, you're right, because as a housing authority, you have access to there's state programs that housing authorities have additional access to through programming and grants that potentially a C4 program would not have access to, and they could be contracted by the housing authority to do that.
Yes,
Yep. Okay, is there any other ones? Sorry, the rental one was a great one. Thank you.
rental in section 8, are we in?
Yes.
Well, I mean, within rental, I mean, trying to convert short-term rentals back into long-term rentals,
Yeah, that would be that deed restriction purchase program. So you're,
Fees.
what else?
Well, I guess a program that has been explained to me, and I don't know if it's like common or actually practical, but like, taking the property that's currently in the rental market, but it's the short-term rental market, and going to that property owner and being like, hey, we'll take a 3-year lease from you and you let us sublease. And, we take that revenue risk, that vacancy risk. We will run the property management for you, we just take all your headaches away for 3 years. And I guess we would put, I don't say deed restriction, but we would then only rent to, local workforce.
Is that the Summit thing?
Yeah, we have a program very similar to that, Jeff, where if you've gotten a recent short-term rental license, we then incentivize it. What we have found is we have to incentivize to different levels, and the incentives are typically between $5,000 and $20,000, depending on the length of the lease. It's extremely expensive.
Okay.
And we have to have a third party who's for administers that on our behalf, which is an additional overhead we have. It is an immediate way to get people into housing, which is why we did it. We're also splitting the cost of that with all of the other jurisdictions in Breckenridge and war chest. They've taken on the bigger part of that.
Good program for a community that's built out.
It's a great
Doesn't
program.
have a whole lot of other options.
Yeah.
And has a lot of.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Finance short.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is all good things to be thinking about because you're gonna have to fund it, but until you have your funding, until you have your budget, until you've taken an assessment of what the other organizations in the community are doing, some of the stuff that the COG is already doing, some of the stuff the coalition does, some of this stuff. Yeah, I would on it, other than to keep everything on the table that your authority could potentially do at some point in time, and as budgets go up and programming goes up. Those kinds of things, you have the opportunity to be flexible on what those programs might be in the future.
Well, I mean, good, that's good, great education. I think maybe back to Sarah's point, it's like, I don't know that I can't think of anything I'd want to preclude.
Yeah, keep it all on the table.
And that's just for the new board to figure out.
Would it be
Yeah, based
possible
on-
for keeping everything on the table, is it possible for the housing authority to fund, not reinvent the wheel, but fund or the other organizations that are already doing those things? So if C4 is already doing
That
it.
would be a great way to
You can
follow
part-
some of that.
Yeah. You
Right,
can partner
because
with them.
then you can have it on the list, but you don't have to go out and find stuff and do it and everything. You can just say, here's your money
Yeah.
for organizations that are already doing it.
And the opposite might happen too, right? Like organizations run programs because nobody else is running them. They're not necessarily, that's their best fit for it, right? So like as the housing authority comes online, and has the budget, and has staff growing, like other organization programs.
I mean, the other thing that I bring down is, again, not to go too far on the lease, is like that great work that Bill Generation did, like getting the one community into a resident. That's awesome.
Yeah, the code expressly allows for contracting with other agencies and entities and stuff to do that.
And again, the reason to have this discussion today is, and I think you guys are hitting it nail on the head, is to put the umbrella over what we're trying to accomplish, right? It's obviously very ambitious, but, and this kind of leads into a question, Dan, for you, is, and I chime in on some other funding, but the war chest that you said, can you describe some of the different war chest funding streams that correct? Yeah. Like what?
So I always forget all the numbers of the letters. I did send that actually all to Jackie. I think after our.
Like, the question from someone on Zoom is, can you talk about like an STR, like the different taxes that exist out there?
Yeah, I mean, there's lodging taxes that are going specifically for it. There are sales taxes that are going into it. There are real estate transfer fees that go into it. I mean, there's an entire, we're very lucky in Summit County to have, and when I say Summit County, that's the county and the towns have lots of different ways to generate revenue. And I would encourage you to keep all of those on the table to be able to do that. And it's everything from the sales, just like Michael had said earlier, The housing authority has taken a cut on every one of the real estate transfers that's happening by doing the title and the actual transfer paperwork. They're getting a little bit.
What of deed restricted units, not of all market.
I'm sorry, right.
units,
of
'cause
the
I think
restricted-
that might
yeah,
be a
I'm
little.
sorry.
A real estate transfer tax is no
Arena
longer,
is a little bit different.
you can't actually pass that, but that's.
Yeah, any more of those, there are some of them that are still out there, but largely those are going away. But yeah, Christie is correct, it's on the deed restricted housing, they're taking their cut as the property transfers, and then that's going back into the help fund. Acquisition, management.
All right, so, checking in here on our meeting agenda, the one thing that I want to talk about on this that I think would be very helpful, because it does go into the bylaws, are potential subcommittees that would have oversight and provide feedback to the board. We are getting into, we have 20 minutes left. We have, if it's okay with everyone, we could, is there any public comment? I mean, we've been allowing public comment as we go. Do we have a need to shut this down 10 minutes early to do public comment, or can we keep going into the last? Huh? Okay, great. So I'm gonna use up all the last 20 minutes then to get through the committee piece. The thing that we will need for bylaws are potential subcommittees that have powers within the board or under the board. And an example is, I'm gonna start with the easy one, the development committee. And one of the important things about a development committee that would be under a board is that you actually have elected representation on your board. And those electeds can get themselves in trouble, i.e. because they know they have a prior existing knowledge of a potential land use application. And how can you kind of dissolve some of that quasi judicial capacity by having a development board that basically functions independently and makes recommendations, so that you don't have electeds directly making and influencing the land use application. Does that make sense? So that's one example of a potential committee. A grievance committee is a really important committee that will need to be established. A grievance committee is not to put Jackie in the spot, is someone doesn't like Jackie's decision. Jackie isn't the final decision maker on that, right? If Jackie says you only get 2 lottery picks and they say I get 4 lottery picks, they get to go in front of a grievance committee for the lottery and get to make, that grievance committee makes the decision. Or I'm not eligible for the lottery because my parent for me in Dayton, Ohio passed me a house that I never wanted to touch, but now it's an asset of mine. And I now have too much asset to qualify for housing, but I'm never moving back to Dayton, Ohio, and my sister isn't going to forgive me for something I did and sell it quick enough so I can be part of this lottery. I mean, those are the types of things that grievance committees can oversee. So those are 2 examples
Sorry, are these committees of the board?
of the board.
So not other people?
No,
Okay.
they could be,
They're-
they could be, they are other people, they're not board members potentially.
So
Or
the
they
question, I
can,
mean, are these only constituted from the board members, or can there be other people nominated to these committees?
secondly.
Okay.
The grievance committee, for instance, are typically a board or 2 board members and an at-large member, because that is that committee doesn't meet on a monthly basis, right? They meet as needed. Whereas, for instance, a development committee would be meeting as development projects go on, and they're the ones in the background kind of putting together the stuff for the board to consider before it goes out to RFQ.
Yeah.
Right.
The reason I said, I think a comment made earlier, there's such board overload and difficulty filling them through the community, like nonprofits or county boards. It just worries me having this many boards. And I know it may be really atypical, but I just wonder if the board just does, I mean, it is all of these.
Well, to Michael's point though, I think like the development committee, you or I or Sarah or a city council member probably would want to be on a development committee to fill out an application for development and then submit it to the planning commission. We have to excuse ourselves from our own hearing because we
Right,
participated in the application process. So I think there's some of those nuances that we need to be fleshed out, and maybe that's just on a case by case basis.
But well, and I think,
Yeah.
and Jeff, to your point, I mean, you can see on the one, like this Cliff Note one that I kind of put together that were just ideas. These are just ideas to get the brain thinking. To your point, it's system overload for your community. So really, let's write the bylaw so that the board is responsible for majority like programming. There's no point in having a separate programming board. I put it out there as just something to think about, because sometimes you have folks that are underrepresented that rely on your programs that would benefit from having a voice, but the reality is they probably have full-time jobs and trying to attend meetings every month. Just to have a committee meeting is just to have a committee meeting, right?
Can these be created later?
Some of them, I would say,
You're gonna want certain standing committees type of thing, and then you can have some authorization for special projects, committees, or that type of thing.
but there's the development committee, I think is probably the one I see the most hair on in political fuzz, is that being a city council member, being the housing board member, and having a land use application, then coming out of this board and coming to council puts you in a compromised position, right?
Chris, could it be something as simple as just having like board of directors to create a committee that deems necessary and appropriate to carry out the affairs of the authority? Could it be something that's
Sounds
simple?
like you're reading.
Curious, yeah, upset, right?
I also.
This is part of the workshop.
We need to know, where is the board chest?
I know, like, there are regional groups though, where it is a shame that there is not an institutional knowledge that goes by, because the county has not previously assigned certain departments to like monitor or participate in those things. So that is kind of, I'm thinking where, like, it'd be really nice to be sure that like a development committee could include land use, because land use understands environmental health, and the board of review and the board of adjustment and the home builders association, like they are associated with all of those. So if there's some way to like, human services should definitely like have a very good understanding of what the housing authority is doing, so that they can serve, like that can, you know, they can promote that, like the resources.
Yep.
Somehow.
And what I would say is just like, Sarah, I agree with everything you just said there. Let's put blue stars next to, going back to our initial list, where did it go? Underneath.
So my understanding that would be a kind of a co-mingling then, Sarah, of like county departments and staff and boards operating under the housing authority, to try to sort of understand.
I'm not making a specific recommendation on what like that committee looks like. I just, Michael, in the beginning, you mentioned non-voting, like staff members that board, I'm not imagining they're a part of the 7, but they're a part of
So
a committee that is like just there to absorb and know what is going on and have the responsibility to like share that with their colleagues and
I
the
think,
rest of the organization.
yep, and I think that gets accomplished through non-voting staff membership. There were in the, where I was on, the board I was on, there was a lot of politics about planners being in the room for board meetings. Just once, so they created a function where it was like, you're allowed to bring one of your planners to the meeting, because they didn't want me to bring 4 planners, and that's not probably the greatest example. But I think what is a more as we think about this, I think there's 2 communities that jump out on this list that I think we should talk through: the grievance committee and the development committee, and spend the last 5 minutes of tonight's meeting on that, and just putting, you guys already came up with some great ideas of potential memberships, so we have kind of a running list. The grievance committee, I think, is really important in that you have a situation, and this is just from practical experience. Housing is a very personal thing. Everybody's housing situation is remarkably different and doesn't fit and bracket well in the community guidelines. I promise you, you could write the guidelines 10,000 times and someone will still have a crazy housing situation that doesn't fall within that disqualifies them. My question for this group is, how do we ensure representation on that grievance committee within the 7 members of the board that allows for fair decision, that Jackie says, you don't fit neatly in my little booklet here, so, but not to exclude them from housing. So how do we, do we want it to be a city and a county representative? Do we want it to be at-large members that oversee that?
Would they be voting or would they be bringing in?
They make the final decision on the grievance.
So it's
They have to have
odd-
final decision.
Odd number, so we
It
don't.
has to be an odd number. You have 7 total board members, so really you're gonna
City,
go 5.
county, at large, 3.
That could be one way to do it, yes. And the reason we actually did a city, county, and at large is that the city and county, we never have to worry about it, there not being like someone serving on that, because if that appointee leaves, then that appointee is made right away. But okay, I'm seeing some head nodding to that, a 3-member.
I mean, it might depend on who the 7 end up being.
Well,
There's more specificity to like who the 3rd is or something.
And to your point, we can write it in the bylaws 1 of 2 ways. We can write it that the board appoints the grievance committee, or we can have it set in the bylaws that the grievance committee shall be made up of a city, county, and 1 at-large member.
Does it ever get as legal, like our grievance committee is the board chair, the attorney, and the HR? Does it ever get to a point where it like needs to be looked into that hard?
You're talking about the potential of excluding somebody from a major asset. Yes,
So would that, but that committee would have access, or that would be a conversation between city and county of what kind of legal resources they would have.
well,
access to?
actually, what you wind up having is that the regional housing authority actually has their own legal counsel, and Chris, you probably should chime in on this, is that board will actually receive its own legal counsel on a grievance. And we have had, I've been in a situation where you had a disabled person who filed a grievance because they weren't allowed to have a service animal or were being evicted because their service animal did something bad, and they were having to be evicted, and there was like a ton of ADA, and the person had nowhere to go after that was the case, but they were also having to choose between like your dog and something that they had, right? So it got really, but this is what I'm talking about. These are the types of things that committee looks at. So it's a really important aspect of it. And Jackie doesn't want to be in a position where she's making a decision, right?
What about thinking of a full board?
Full board is tough because I would not recommend the full board, because you really want to be able to have the ability for that person to it's the judge, jury, executioner at that level. That's it. They make their decision and it's done. There's no.
The grievance committee does? Okay.
And it doesn't have to be public.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's the smaller.
No, I think,
It does have to be public. They can go into executive session if there's disclosure stuff that can't be public.
The grievance.
Yeah. If it gets messy, it gets real messy. That's what I'm telling you, like, this is one that's worth talking about. Okay, so I'm hearing, so there was 2 options on the table. There was doing it where there's a city and county and an at-large, and that's written in the bylaws, or doing it the easy way, because not that they came out earlier, which is the board appoints a grievance committee.
But to Sarah's point, with your addition, right, it could be city, county rep, and then the housing authority's attorney, right? Like not city or county council, but the housing authority specific council is on that committee, right? And then it would be 3 people, 5 member, like, able to make decisions.
Mhm.
Right.
Any strong feelings?
Would that decision have to be ratified by the board?
No.
No,
It's like in a separate entity.
but I mean by the Like grievance committee might have to submit a recommendation to the board to accept.
You could,
You could structure it that way. I don't know that you want to. but
No,
that's-
yeah, I know, I just want to make sure that you're protecting, like, information that should not be disseminated.
you actually wouldn't, politically, you wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to give the applicant not that you don't want to give the applicant a second chance at it, but if you have a really messy grievance that you have to ratify the board, then it has to go again. And go through that whole other stuff again. I wouldn't suggest that,
Okay.
just
no, that's
knowing how these go.
So if we didn't designate it with city and county, then it could be any one of the seven.
Mhm.
So is there benefit to having that flexibility?
Again, this to me is really an important inclusivity question for you guys to consider now of how you think you best represent, how you can best represent and protect the people you serve, because this is where and I can tell you from my experiences of seeing the grievances that have come through the grievance committee, you would never even dream up some of the stuff that could come up through this, but those are normally the most vulnerable. They're, in some cases, they're the most vulnerable people in the community, and making sure that they have the ability to speak to their peers or the people that are on this board is really important. Because you're talking about the potential of someone losing their housing sometimes, right? They could be in a situation where they violated the deed restriction. You know, and it's not their doing, for instance, like, you know, my spouse passed, so I had someone who got caught in an avalanche, and they were on their title of the property. But their person that was living there didn't have a legal right. You know, it's like, how are we gonna do it with the lottery? I mean, there's some housing is very personal. So I mean, sharing these things, like, they're like,
So would you say that would make you more inclined to have the flexibility of the board appointing the grievance committee, or would that
Yeah.
push you towards designating it more?
it really comes down to me, is just how we draft to it, because this is your decision. But the important thing is that you're not, what you just brought up is, you can't be making the grievance, you can't be making the decision of who's gonna sit on the grievance committee based on who's coming in front of you for the grievance. That grievance committee needs to be appointed, and be sitting there, so that when it comes, they're there. So, and that person has, just like under the justice system, they have a fair, expedient trial.
Well, I guess I like the idea of it being appointed by the board, because if we say it has to be a city and a county, then that sort of elevates that role over the others in some way. But also, don't feel super strong.
Well, and one of the things that looking at the different committees and stuff too, I've noticed that some of the different samples and stuff I've looked at have, one of the committees has been like a management committee type of thing. And in some instances, perhaps the management committee would serve as the grievance committee. And that way it's by positions versus people, if you will, again.
But I would, yeah, and I understand what you're saying, I would definitely make sure staff is not put in the position to do that.
Yeah.
Any other strong, again, it's really comes down to, the more clarity we get, the easier it is to draft to, so.
I would just offer that boards, for the ways that I've seen the systems fail are in relying on volunteers, or who I might like at-large people, members of the group who are not, like, you put them in a black and white, you know, having a decision, and they are backed by managing, or they don't have the management or HR support or staff support, and that's not part of their role. It's a very difficult decision to make and put volunteers in. So I would just think about like what is typical in your.
Yeah, so Kurt's point, is it a requirement to have a grievance committee? And I'm gonna check this tomorrow, but I'm pretty sure that some county housing authority gets those kinds of things just get referred directly to our attorney's office. Some county Jeff Buckley actually acts on behalf of those things. So is it something that's absolutely required? Because I would share Sarah's concern that, man, it was really tough.
This thing's been going on since
And people who are not
5:30.
professionals to deal with it.
And yeah, it increases the subjectivity of the decision.
I would actually push back on that dramatically, Dan, because what happens is that you have an attorney who's made a decision and you don't give them.
Right, I see your point. I think that it's a good one. I'm just sort of trying to figure
Sure.
out, you know,
Well,
how.
and as I say, in most instances, the attorney isn't the decision maker, maybe it's referred for a review and recommendation or
Like
something.
a review and recommendation or a mediation or something along those lines. Is there another path that it could take? Rather than, to where it's more people who are professionals in dealing with those kinds of things.
So to your point, then, what I've seen happen, again, this isn't the catch-all, but what normally happens is actually Jackie renders her decision. Her decision is the public record, right? And the attorney for the housing authority will add on to the public decision and sit on the side to basically, if there's questions of the grievance committee, to ask and receive legal advice. I do want to stress this one because I've seen it. This is, when you talk about, again, inclusivity of a board and really like, it's going, the decision one way or the other is going to, I mean, it's a small community, right? It's gonna be like, did you hear what's happened to so-and-so and their housing? And and if you're living in affordable housing and that decision is rendered and they're your neighbor and all of a sudden they're out of house, I mean, it impacts that neighborhood, right? So I just, yeah.
That's the other like side of the point of my point of like having somebody who's kind of makes those kinds of decisions and also is like unresponsible for those kinds of, it's like, we're put in the position to make hard choices and I don't know that everybody, I mean, whoever might be appointed to this board should understand that. But it is not often embraced. Even if you're expected to make a hard decision.
All right, well, we'll bookmark that last one. Is there any, I mean, is there something you want us to bring back? You want us to bring back to county or city, county and at large and go from there and debate a little bit more, like Sarah's point? It's completely, this is your board.
As far as just for
the draft, I mean, again, this is a draft, this is just a draft, but the more we can draft to, we're trying to get you guys a readable draft, not one with a bunch of holes in it. When we come back, so, okay, well.
I guess I like the idea of the board deciding based on the configuration of the board. If someone else has it, lean the other way, I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, all right, well, it's 8:02 now, I've gone over 2 minutes. Thank you, we covered a lot of ground today, this is huge. The things I have left on here to talk through is whether or not you want to designate any additional committees. We want to get back a definitive on how a tax initiative originates and launches through. Is there any other major ones I'm missing in the group that were kind of touched? Those are the two. I mean, this is amazing. We got through.
The housing authority. I mean,
Well,
I think that's why we're all here.
I think-
What y'all here to do with us.
I think the initial feedback I got tonight was please keep doing what you're doing, because this is not gonna happen fast. That's fine.
I don't think we're at that point yet. I think we still have to go through some more of this planning. I don't know that that's up to. board county
It isn't,
commissioners.
that's the point I was gonna make, it's,
See that feed up and-
yeah, it's the Leadville Housing Authority would be up to the city council
Yeah.
to
I
decide
would
what
really
is.
need to see better analysis of what that would mean. I don't feel like
Yeah, we need the options.
yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
I think that would be helpful to us, is to sort of get a read on, because we operate under, I'm on the housing authority, it's Greg, the mayor asked me to be on the housing authority, I said, absolutely, let's do it. I have plenty of other things I could be doing, but just from the standpoint of, we can continue to operate, under the city, I think we would be fine with that. we sort of, when all of these conversations initially came up, we sort of thought that we would just sort of dissolve and reform into a new housing authority. I think we're willing to take that role, be an action with essentially a resolution dissolving, it's followed by a resolution with the city and county to reform us. We would be open to that. And if it's something completely new and different, we're okay, could potentially be okay with that, as long as we don't go away, so we can continue our core services. And I understand that this is gonna take some time. We just want to know where we're at, so we can be thinking about what we need to be doing. We just hired a new staff. Should we not be thinking about hiring new staff? Should we be looking at growing some of our other services? So just some of that would be helpful to us. And we would love to hear back. We're specifically invited to this meeting, but it would be nice to be continuing to be part of it.
I think we know some of the options, and it's, as Chris kind of mentioned, it's to, I think completely dissolve and reform. But the one wrinkle I think I'm gonna talk to you about is that there are some legal agreements between the Leadville Housing Authority and the Housing and Urban Development, which may put a wrinkle in how complicated it would be to not have the housing authority continue to exist. So to answer your question is, I think there's a few more wrinkles to it, and I think that's what the analysis we need to figure out, because if we have to get HUD to do something, I'm gonna tell you, that is going to take forever with a big four in front of it, and it may just be the path of least resistance to find a way to not have.
Totally understand.
And so to that end too, one of the things that we'll need to look at is, part of it is that the authority, if you will, can't overlap between the two. So the different roles would have to be, different roles.
If we were in Leadville managing property, then the multi-jurisdictional housing authority would be managing property in this as well, right?
Yes,
So
correct.
And then the regional housing authority cannot utilize all the toolbox that they.
Yeah, so I think from our standpoint, it would just be really nice that as this conversation moves forward, that we start seeing those outlined as part of the discussion and part of the agenda, frankly, of what we're talking about. And it's, this is not a power play, this is not any of that. We want to be walking this road together so we understand what's coming for our organization. And recognize that it could be lots of different things.
I need to imagine having enough people to have both.
I mean, that's kind of where, when this all started 6 years ago, and we started having, with Adam on board alone, and we started this work through the housing coalition and all of that other stuff. That's sort of why we're trying to get some capacity onto the housing authority. And we're not, we don't have a particular direction that we're trying to steer. Only that we're being a part of the conversation. So when, so this doesn't happen in the vacuum, and all of a sudden, they're like, oh, you guys don't exist anymore. Go find somebody to manage your place. And I just want to hear that from the elected officials very clearly, and we haven't yet.
Yeah, I think we're still somewhat in the infancy stages of trying to have our legal counsel really flesh out those.
Yeah, no, it sounds like they're making great progress.
And I think really the position from my perspective is that we're not in a place where we want to do this in a vacuum and not include what tools we already have in the toolbox. But we also want to be very careful and diligent about the decisions that we're making so that a future board isn't tied to a decision that worked really well right now, but may not work well in the future, right? Because we've come up against that a lot. And so we just want to make sure that we're setting it up for success.
Those are all great words.
And then I think, so Jackie and Tim have been regularly coming to Housing Authority, and the first of those are the folks who will continue to update the Housing Authority on the progress. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah.
Or, you think city council doesn't know you exist, you need to come to city council and tell us you exist.
Well. I mean.
Even when you get the 3-minute public comment and just say we're here, this is what we're doing, big to go for aid, we just hired to do first.
Well, Mayor Lobby is the one that really dug us up and exposed us.
We're trying to get you on our website too.
Yeah.
You don't even exist on our website.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now do.
Okay.
I was also gonna just say, I mean, like, you guys can part of elected officials say, I mean, I'll echo, like, back what you said, I mean, we also are not trying to play any power play here, like, and we're not trying to dissolve Mount Massive Manor, and I also recognize that a lot of people joined the existing housing authority board because they have a broader interest and expertise in housing, so I appreciate that and the time and expertise, so not trying to sideline that or shove anything in a box somewhere else, just trying to do whatever, yeah, doesn't create some unforeseen legal issue down the road or cost more lawyer fees or require another thing.
And I
Yeah.
was, you know, the thing too, I was gonna say, Christiana and I think we make a pretty good team of trying to bird dog some of these issues, so use the resources that are available versus.
Christiana was great, helping us rewrite our bylaws and it's been instrumental in that. And it's it was very good. It still was. Me on her time.
So what information, just real quick, just so I can summarize this, what information is still needed out there to allow the city council to dig into this? There was a HUD agreement you mentioned?
Yeah, but Chris and Christiana and I will talk. We have the documents that you dug up, I found. But they're like from 2004, and there are a number of agreements between the housing authority and HUD.
Okay.
So we have to figure out what happens with those.
Yeah, so I think we currently pay our mortgage to,
Yep, until 2034.
yeah, so there is some entanglement there. Yeah, honestly, it's the same.
My crystal ball is saying we're keeping the Leadville housing authority in place, at least in
Just for
regards to
that
that
reason,
property,
right?
yeah.
You know, and then if we, y'all want a different board, whatever, we'll figure that out as we go.
Yeah.
I would love to stay, part of it, but yeah, I mean, there may be some just practical reasons that it happened that way, and that's why we always sort of just assume that.
Be interesting to know, like, what's the outstanding balance on that?
Oh, no.
It's was.
Okay.
585,000 in 2004. So quickly doing that, I have no idea.
Go ahead.
Hopefully less.
Well, that was, thank you, and so we had a little bit of a different agenda for May 19th planned. I don't think we've made it to the point where we're ready to talk about the development strategies, and I think we should let the charrette play out anyways to come out with a recommendation on what barriers to entry those potential three properties have. So I think the next meeting we will dedicate to finishing up this conversation, which I think we need to put a bow on it, as well as putting some time towards the effort of what you guys have just asked for. I think it's very valid ask.
Yeah, we would love that to be a agenda item.
Yep.
Line item.
Not a problem. So thanks, everyone. We've made significant progress. This is great. We are inching closer to having the governance done. Thank you.
Thank you.